This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Most of you aren't just listening right now. You're driving, cleaning, and even exercising. But what if you could be saving money by switching to Progressive? Drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Multitask right now. Quote today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations.
Hello, friends. This is No Small Endeavor. I'm Lee C. Camp. You're listening to our Unabridged interview with Mr. Eboo Patel. Eboo is the founder and president of Interfaith America, headquartered in Chicago, Illinois. Eboo is one of those folks I've heard about for years, and thought it would be delightful to get to go up to Chicago and sit with him and talk with him. So I was grateful that they welcomed me to their office downtown Chicago. I always look for any good excuse to get away to Chicago for a little bit, and it was a delightful trip going up to see Eboo. I've done a little bit of work in my academic field and doing some study and research and writing on interfaith conversations and dialogue. And it seems that there are a number of sort of stereotypical ways some people approach thinking about relating to people of other faith traditions. There's on the one hand, those who are immediately suspect and want nothing to do with someone from another faith tradition, always assume the worst or even violent presumptions or intentions about people of the other. Then on the other hand, there are those kind of on the other end of the spectrum who want to suggest that all religions are saying the same things, they might say, or that they're all about peace, or that they all are about some reducible essence between them. And I don't find that particularly helpful either, because in fact, if you look closely at various religious traditions, they are often saying quite different things. There's a third sort of approach that I have found myself more drawn to, and that is to respect the differences between various faith traditions and to take those differences seriously, and at the same time presume that there might be resources within those traditions that allow people of adherents of those different traditions to do some really remarkable and interesting things together. That third approach is one represented by Eboo Patel, and I hope you find this interview interesting and provocative and quite helpful. Enjoy. Eboo Patel is founder and president of Interfaith America, a Chicago-based international nonprofit that aims to promote interfaith cooperation. He has a doctorate in the sociology of religion from Oxford University, was a member of President Barack Obama's inaugural advisory council on faith-based neighborhood partnerships. Eboo is the author of numerous books, will especially be today working out of his memoir, Acts of Faith, and his most recent book, We Need to Build, Field Notes for Diverse Democracy. Today we're sitting together on a beautiful day in downtown Chicago at the offices of Interfaith America. Eboo, thanks for having us.
It's great to be with you, Lee, and it is indeed a beautiful day. It's 50 degrees in December.
Hard to believe.
Yes.
I was not expecting this coming to Chicago. Yes. I spent 5 years in South Bend, Indiana, trying to get used to my blood thickening up.
Yeah.
And then when I moved back south again, it thinned up again. So
I began my early days there when my dad was a graduate student, and I lovingly call it the land of gray snow and white Catholics.
It is both of those, yes. I remember lots of beautiful days getting up early in the morning. I would ride the city bus and trekking through the snow, fresh snow at 5:30 in the morning to get a bus. So anyway, it's good to be back in Chicago. Thanks for having us. So would you begin with perhaps a synopsis for the kind of work that you all are doing with Interfaith America?
So the goal of Interfaith America, the organization, is to help build Interfaith America, the nation. And in fact, the nation is already Interfaith America, which is to say we are the political entity in which the most people from the most different religions have gathered. We're the most religiously diverse nation in human history. We don't yet have that self-conception of ourselves. We think of ourselves still as a Judeo-Christian nation, and we actually think of the term Judeo-Christian or the concept as having been around forever, right? Like if the Pilgrims didn't find it on Plymouth Rock, then, Moses was given it on Sinai kind of thing, right? The truth is Judeo-Christian was an invention, and it was an invention of the 1930s. And it was a response to the ugly white Christian nationalism of the 1920s, better known as the KKK. And so this group of people with a vision of pluralism, a vision of folks from different identities coming together to respect each other, to relate positively, to cooperate in concrete projects. They developed a paradigm which was opposed to the paradigm of white Christian nationalism that wound up winning. And so we refer to the nation as Judeo-Christian, which at the time really meant the welcoming of Jews and Catholics into what was thought of as a Protestant nation. Well, now we have as many Muslims in America as we have ELCA Lutherans, twice as many Muslims as we have Episcopalians, right? Something like a quarter of the nation says they're atheist or agnostic or secular humanist. Our demographics have grown significantly since the 1930s. It's time for our concepts to catch up. So we like to say that we are helping America realize religious diversity is a treasure. It's here. It's a treasure. Let's make sure that cooperation, that we implement the idea that cooperation is better than division, that religious diversity is a treasure, that faith is a bridge of cooperation.
And what are your kind of day-to-day projects or initiatives look like?
Yeah, so we are a 55 person organization. We have roughly a $13 million budget. We are by orders of magnitude the largest organization in the United States that deals specifically with religious diversity issues. The difference that the NCCJ, the National Conference for Christians and Jews, made in the 20th century, they're the organization that really ushered in the paradigm Judeo-Christian. We hope to make a similar difference in the 21st century. I would say roughly half of our work is in higher education. We have a network of something like 600 college campuses that we work with. We're doing everything from helping college presidents develop interfaith strategic plans to helping freshman orientation advisors include religious diversity in their freshman orientation. We also work with religious diversity issues in private companies, in healthcare institutions, and in democracy issues more broadly. So we have a project called Faith in the Elections to make sure that the election is both safe and trusted. We have a project called Team Up, which brings together some of the largest civic organizations in America, Catholic Charities, Habitat for Humanity, and the YMCA to be places that widen their welcome of diversity and strengthen the bridges amongst diverse people. And a huge part of what we do is we tell the story of Interfaith America. We tell it as an inspiring story and kind of as an aspiration that the nation is slowly understanding that it already is, but that it can kind of manifest in reality.
When you think about the work that you all have been doing here for how many years now?
This is the 21st year that the organization has been kind of a formal nonprofit. And so that's, since 2002, we kind of formalized as a nonprofit. And I had the idea 4 years before with one of the guys here who's behind the camera. Kevin Koval was with me when and kind of had the idea as a group, and it just never let go of me.
When you think about some of the success stories, what are some that stand out to you through those 20 plus years?
I'm really proud of what some of the leaders we've nurtured have done. I'm really proud of a guy named Greg Damhorst, who, back in the mid 2000s, after the terrible earthquake in Haiti, gathered 5,000 people in Champaign-Urbana to pack meal kits for the victims of the earthquake in Haiti. There's been dozens and dozens of projects like that. Greg just happens to come to mind because he grew up in the Chicagoland area as an evangelical Christian with friends who were Hindu and Jain, and he was constantly trying to figure out how he could be rooted in his own identity and in positive partnership with people of other identities, which is so much of what we do. And I'm proud that during the Obama years, we ran the President's Interfaith Challenge in partnership with the White House. 500 campuses would gather every year to make a commitment to interfaith cooperation and to develop plans to actually execute on that commitment. I'm really proud that when the vaccine came out, we had a project called the Faith in the Vaccine Ambassadors, which were people located in communities across the United States, roughly 2,000 people emerging from 200 different institutions, many of them evangelical colleges actually, who were trained to positively engage people's religious identities about the vaccine. They weren't convincing people to take the vaccine. They were encouraging people to consider how their religious identity would encourage them to consider the vaccine.
Yeah.
Like, is this part of being a good neighbor? kind of a thing? Is this part of treating your body's a temple of the Holy Spirit?
I mean, it already strikes me as somewhat counterintuitive, perhaps to some who are listening, to hear two things being held together that seems, from what I can tell, precisely one of the things that you've tried to do with your vocation. Namely, you're pointing to certain kind of progressive ideals while also being very explicit about engaging people's particular religious identities. So any commentary on that?
I mean, I think that that's the American project right there, right? I think that we have to realize, like, we live in a nation that for the vast majority of Western civilization, for sure, people thought was impossible, which is to say, people thought it was impossible for different identities to gather in a single political entity, particularly a democracy. And what makes a democracy distinct? It's people get to participate in public life, right? So you could have religious diversity in a dictatorship or in an empire because the dictator would basically curtail or contain your identity. But in a democracy, you actually get to articulate your identity. You get to say you're pro-life or pro-choice. You get to say where you think the line should be drawn in the Middle East. And you get to try to affect public discourse and policy. And so the idea that you would live alongside people who were literally trying to enact a policy that was opposite of your, not just politics, but your identity. People thought that was impossible. And here we are attempting that in the United States. And I have to say, people say all the time about how terrible things are going. And I think things could be a lot better in the United States. Let me be clear. But I read a New York Times article 10 or 12 years ago that I write about in my book, We Need to Build, which begins with the image when there is a fire on the Muslim side of the city of Mostar in the nation of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Catholic fire department does not respond. When there's a fire on the Catholic side of Mostar, the Muslim fire department does not respond. Now, you read that as an American, and it's like you're reading about Mars, because we don't have Catholic and Muslim fire departments, right? But what you're actually reading is a description of most of human history. In most of human history, groups that convene around a particular identity, Muslim, Catholic, they build institutions that serve their own community. And that oftentimes are in tension with and sometimes actively cultivate hostility with other communities. So, who are firefighters? They're like burly men in their 30s. Okay. So if there's hostility between Muslims and Catholics in Mostar, where do you think the militias gather? Right? It is a civil society built by groups of particular identities that build institutions that serve people of all identities.
You've indicated that this vision wasn't a vision necessarily which you saw in your early life. You say at one point, I'm an American Muslim from India. My adolescence was a series of rejections, one after another, of the various dimensions of my heritage, in the belief that India and Islam could not coexist within the same being. If I wanted to be one, I could not be the others.
Listen, I grew up in the white western suburbs of Chicago in the 1980s with the name Eboo, right? Amidst a bunch of like Sams, Jacks, Johns, JJs, and Adams, right? Like, let me tell you something. Like it is both a joke, but also like a profound moment of alienation when your mother puts a samosa in your lunch and you spend the day being ridiculed for it. So it's a joke, but actually it is a profound moment because your mother lovingly put that samosa in your lunch, right? That is your heritage. That is the food that has nurtured your ancestors for generations. And you go to school and it is ridiculed. And you're 9 years old and you look at your mother and you say, you are the source of my ridicule, right? So look, I have to say something. I am over that. I'm 48 years old. And if like you can't get over, things that happened to you when you were 9, like there's some growing up that happens, but it is useful to remember that.
Yeah.
It's useful to remember that. And it's useful to say no 9-year-old should have to go through that, right? That is not the center of my existence. I don't think that should be the center of like American politics, but I don't think that should happen.
Right.
So growing up for me was like a series of kind of figuring this stuff out. And where I come to is actually like very much kind of on the side of James Baldwin and Jane Addams and Barack Obama and Martin Luther King Jr., which is like people should be proud of their identities. People should view their identities as assets. People should bring their assets to the table in the same way that you might bring a dish to a potluck. What makes a potluck special is not just the diversity of dishes, it's the way the dishes are in combination and the way the people are in conversation.
Right. So I appreciate your saying I'm over that, but I also think that if we could dig into that just a little bit more, because I think it would get very instructive for folks, because I think we find ourselves in a context in which so many are still in a position of rage or carrying about the pain of such circumstances. So what did it look like for you you've indicated both in your early memoir and also in your most recent book that as you went to college, that move began to kind of move you from accepting / not seeing the kinds of pain or difficulties that some of those childhood experiences were causing, and then you kind of move into a place of rage?
Yeah. So I'll tell multiple parts of the story, and you can make it separate questions if you want to over the. So in high school, there was literally no language. There was no framework which helped me make sense of that samosa experience. Okay, like I thought that was my dirty little secret, right? And I thought the problem was me. I thought the problem was with my skin and with my food, not with other people's eyes or with other people's noses or with other people's like racism, right? Yeah. That's racism.
And to be fair, you tell quite a number of other stories in both of those books about things that you experienced as a high school. There's a multiplicity of sorts of offenses and so forth.
So there is a story to tell about the racism that I experienced. And I've written like it is a thread. I've written 5 books. It's a thread through every single one. It would be an incomplete story of my life if I didn't say those things, right? And I get to college, and actually the frameworks in college, white supremacy, colonialism, imperialism, race, institutionalized racism, it encourages me to tell those stories. Now, all of a sudden, the stories that I thought were my dirty little secret were an occasion for me, were a microphone for me. I was the kid in class talking all the time. I was the student activist on the quad telling these stories all the time. And at some point, like, I think I realized, like, this has become all of who I am. Like, I am now only telling the story of my being a victim of racism. And actually, the truth is, that is not how I grew up. That is not how I was raised. So I'm an Ismaili Muslim. I'll tell you something about being an Ismaili. So we are a small small community of Shia Muslims. And the distinguishing feature of Ismailis is that we have what's called a present and living imam, kind of like a pope figure, right? So who guides the spirituality, and also in some ways the material life of the community, right? So very much like the Pope would encourage Ismailis to go into certain endeavors of human life, like the arts, for example, are highly encouraged, and also how to interpret the Islamic tradition, the Quran, the Hadith, etc. So Ismailis have been chased out of many countries. Ismailis developed a practice called taqiyya, which is like secrecy, which is basically like we are so accustomed to being persecuted that we developed a legal doctrine where we can secretly pretend we are not Ismailis so that we wouldn't be persecuted. There's about 15 million of us in the world, about the same number as Jews. So I did my PhD on Ismaili religious education, beginning with the teachings of the Imam. I have not found in 60, 70 years of the Imams, that are current Aga Khan, the current leader of the Ismaili tradition, in reading 60 to 70 years of the Imam's teachings to the community, a single place where he has called us victims or the oppressed or the marginalized, right? So I come from like a religious tradition, and I come from a culture, and I come from a household that acknowledge things can be hard. Let's not be blind to that. It is harder to have brown skin than white skin. It is harder to be a woman than to be a man. It is harder to be gay than to be straight. And if you allow yourself to think of yourself as a victim rather than an agent, you are doing yourself the greatest harm that you could do. Because what God gave you is agency. Like literally, that is what God gives you, is agency. right? So it's kind of a violation of a spiritual ethic, but it's also honestly kind of a violation of like, of just basic knowledge about the world. So I'll tell you a story that I don't think I've ever told before. It actually happens with Kevin. We're together in India. Okay. So this is summer of 1998, and we're at an ice cream shop in Bombay, right? And like honestly, only rich people in Bombay can afford ice cream. So we're there with a bunch of rich people, and it's the summer, so it's the monsoon season, and it starts to just like out of monsoon means like just out of nowhere, it will just pour buckets, right? And across the street from the ice cream shop, I see this family that's sleeping on the street. It must be 10:30 at night. I don't even know if you remember this, Kevin. And I look out, and this kid, the like kid in the family, like 10-year-old kid, like wakes up and just starts to wail. Mm. And the father looks at the kid just helplessly. He just can't do anything, right? And I'm like 20 years old. I'm 23 actually, 22, 23. And like I've like cultivated this like sophisticated intellectual self of being oppressed, like reading Frantz Fanon and Foucault and whatever. And I look out at this family like suffering this monsoon on the streets and just thinking to myself, I like feel gross. I feel grotesque for like thinking to myself, like, I'm the oppressed one. Actually, more of humanity lives closer to that person's life than to my life. Mm-hmm. Like when the rain falls, I don't get wet. I am under shelter, right? And so it's not just to only tell a victim story of myself is not, again, just a violation of like a spiritual ethic. It is to like literally erase that person's existence. And we live in a world of 8 billion people. 1.5 billion people have parasitic worms in their systems. 4 billion people live on less than $7 a day. If I call myself oppressed, what word do I have for them?
Yeah, you tell a story about where I think at another time you're in India with your father in the car, perhaps.
Yeah. This is the taxi cab. Yeah.
Will you share that story?
Yeah. So I mean, this is a similar story, right? Like, I mean, I'm daft enough to have to learn lessons over and over again.
Aren't we all?
You know. But this is actually a couple years later. I'm in India. So this must be like January of 2000. Kevin and I went in the summer of 1998. I went with my friend Jeff in the summer of actually it was January 2001. We were in India. And again, for whatever reason, I'm like cultivating like, you know, it's like part of the problem is these days it's sophisticated to think of yourself as a victim, right? Like if you get smart, all of a sudden you like think of yourself more as a victim than as an agent. There's kind of a craziness around that, you know. In any case, now I'm a PhD student at Oxford, right? And I'm reading all these like fancy books, and I'm telling my dad in this taxi cab in Bombay, and again, only rich people can afford taxi cabs in Bombay, about how, you know, England and Oxford don't know what to do with their South Asian population, their kind of darker population, whether it's South Asian or Jamaican or African or whatever. It's like the empire strikes back and they're so uncomfortable with us. They don't know what to do with us, but we still feel marginalized and oppressed. And my dad gives me this look and he points to this child beggar on the street of Bombay. By the way, like every street corner in Bombay has dozens of leprous child beggars. Like the thing that shocks you when you arrive in India, by day 2, you're just inured to it. You just have to be, right? And my dad says, if you're oppressed, what word do you have for that kid? Right? And again, like it's this feeling of grotesqueness. Like it is a grotesque idea to be sitting comfortably in a car, to have a 8-year-old kid reach out a stump of an arm to you, and to be telling your traveling partner how you're oppressed as you shake your head in a scolding way to that kid.
Yeah.
It's grotesque.
Yeah, there's another passage about your father where I think, if I remember correctly, you had shared with him a memoir by a white Christian terrorist. And I'm forgetting what memoir it was. But you say that your father couldn't get through the memoir because he said, quote, "It reminds me too much of you. It scares the shit out of me what you could have become."
Yeah. I mean, I went through a period where I don't know, I was narrow and angry and all kinds of other stuff. And it might have been the Atlanta Olympics bomber in 1996, who then hides out in like the North Carolina woods for years. So there was a period of time when I was a fuse that could have been lit, and it just so happened I got lucky, right? Kevin and I become friends around this time, and we run into a guy named Brother Wayne Teasdale. And he just takes us in a different direction, right? But there's like this ball of energy. There's a great line by Gwendolyn Brooks. She writes, "I shall create, if not a note, then a whole, if not an overture, then a desecration." And I just think of like, that's so many young people, right? Just balls of energy. And which direction are they going to go? Which direction? And it has everything to do. I write this in Acts of Faith. Is that it has everything to do with who meets you at the crossroads.
Yeah. Along this line, you also in Need to Build, you speak of the dangers of making generalizations and speaking for others.
Yes.
Would you unpack that for us some? Yeah,
I mean, like, I really can't stand this, you know. So there was a congresswoman who said, we don't need any more black faces in Congress who are not going to be black voices. All right, so there are 13% of America is black. Okay, so that's roughly what, 40 million people? So tell me, is there one voice that represents 40 million people? I mean, like, there's not one voice that represents me in any given day, right? Like in other words, I have like 6 different views that are contradictory in any given day, right? And so this notion of like, there is like an essentialist Muslim view or an essentialist female view. And by the way, you have it. You know what it is. You can demand it of others, and you can like erase or cancel or marginalize people who don't say that. That just seems like it's so offensive, right? And part of what gets me is at a time in which like representation is such a kind of vaunted notion. Are you represented? Are you right? Wouldn't we be careful in speaking for others? Like, here's the image, right? What happens if you're at the head of the rally and let's say it's just to use my own identity, it's a rally of Ismaili Muslims. There's 10,000 of us, and you have the microphone, and you're saying, we want A, B, and C. And 5,000 people in the crowd are like, that's not what I want. Right? Like, that's the image in my mind.
Yeah.
You know?
Right. Yeah. You say that I think your language was, it drives me crazy. What's the source of that being such a sore spot for you?
Well, I mean, I think that it is a huge part of the discourse now, right? People of color think, Black people think, Muslims believe, right? Like it is a manner in which it is a dominant dimension of the discourse now to create a category which is actually extremely internally diverse, extremely heterogeneous. I think that there is such a thing as there's a coherent thing called the African American experience, but coherent doesn't mean univocal.
Yeah, right.
And I think that there are categories which honestly don't make any sense. I think the category people of color makes no sense. Okay, so there's 8 billion people in the world. What percentage of them are people of color?
I don't know, but certainly the majority.
Yeah. So let's just roughly call it 75%. So that's what, 6 billion people? So you're going to tell me that you can put 6 billion people into a single category? That just seems, I don't know, crazy. Yeah. But here we are using the category all the time.
And
assuming that it has a single view that you, with the microphone on the soapbox, can articulate.
Yeah. I mean, I would presume that the best presumption behind use of such categories or language is purportedly trying to lean into some sort of good for that group. There's a case typically being made for pushing back against oppression or pushing back against injustice, purportedly for the good of the group being spoken about. Is that fair?
I think the intention around these things often starts in a positive place. And I think the first couple steps down the path are useful steps, right? So there are no small number of events that I go to. I'm the founder and president of a medium-sized nonprofit. I'm at fancy events all the time. There are lots of white people at those events. It is not unfair to say that.
Yeah.
It is a true thing to say, right? Like, so if that is where the discussion of where people of color begin, that is a useful place to say, why is it that when I'm true story, like in the football stadium, 80% of the players, 70% of the players are black, 40% of the stadium, or 40% of the stadium is 60% of the stadium is white, and 90% of the president's box is white, right? That having that observation is a useful observation. Getting to step 20 down that path, right, where now you have reified this category of people of color and essentialized it, right? So the first couple of steps are exploratory. They're not dogmatic. I think this is one of the kind of big distinctions. I say to my teenage sons all the time, be in a mode of inquiry, not in a mode of judgment, right? When something begins with an inquiry, that's very useful. When you're making an observation and making an inquiry, that is very useful. We shouldn't be afraid to do that around categories related to race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality. We should, America's had, 44, 45, 46 presidents, and every single, 2 Catholics, 1 black guy, 40, right? Like that's we should observe that. That's a moment of observation and reflection, right? We should have a conversation. But for it to lead to a different kind of dogma, not useful.
Yeah. Well, you say in your most recent book, you close with a letter to your sons, and you say that things like rage or critical theories and seeing themselves as oppressed is not the way you want them to move forward. And then you say, quote, generally, I like for you to give people the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just it's seeing something like critical theory as a helpful diagnostic and then leaning into other additional, maybe put it that way, then leaning into additional sorts of postures or disciplines to try to find ways forward.
I think that's exact. So I think critical theory, anti-racism, et cetera, a very useful critique, a very useful voice to have around the table. As a paradigm, it is useless. Here's why it's useless. Because the definition of a critique is a voice or a lens that's pointing out things that the paradigm doesn't explain. That's extremely useful, right? Hey, you're not talking about race when it comes to policing. You are missing something, okay? But a paradigm is an explanatory framework that says it can explain everything, right? So the theory that the sun revolves, that the Earth revolves around the sun, that here's the science of how the galaxy works, is meant to explain everything. It's meant to explain how not just the Earth works, but all the planets in the Milky Way and the moons, et cetera, right? That's a paradigm. So anti-race as a paradigm doesn't work because there's a million things it doesn't explain. It doesn't explain the success of Asian Americans in elite education and in professional life. It doesn't explain the success of African Americans in the high arts and in entertainment, right? There's all kinds of things it doesn't explain. But we've actually gone a step further than anti-racism as a paradigm. We are now at anti-racism as a social order or an operating system. That's where you get like bias response teams, right? That's where you have the ability to punish and coerce. Now we're beyond this is useless. Now we are this is odious. Right? When you can punish people, when you can coerce people based on a paradigm that doesn't explain an awful lot of facts in the world, now we're at a problem. But my work is not principally critiquing anti-racism. My work is principally advancing pluralism. One of the reasons I talk about anti-racism is because it is a different kind of diversity paradigm that I think creates an us versus themness that is not a positive force in a diverse democracy.
Well, related to this, you also talk about in your most recent book the importance of not. In your most recent book, you also talk about the importance of having more than just one story to tell. That is, that there's a diversity of ways that we want to think about ourselves individually, and that gives us a richness to think about how we might relate with one another. Right.
I mean, I remember, it's funny. Like I quote people you might call anti-racist all the time because I find some of the theories useful. I like it, right? So in other words, my critique is not a total critique. It is principally about like we need to be building pluralism. But let me quote somebody who might be considered an anti-racist, and that's Cornel West. And so I remember seeing Cornel West on C-SPAN once. This is many, many, many years ago. And this guy calls in. It's like a book TV, and it's a call-in show. And somebody calls in and says, I disagree with all of your political theory and economic theory, Professor West. I'm a big jazz head. And Cornel West kind of leans in and says, well, let's talk about Miles. Let's talk about Train. And I thought that was such a beautiful moment, right? Like this guy saying, I disagree on this stuff, but I like this stuff. And Cornel West said, well, let's start talking about what we like together, right? And I just thought that was so, and actually, there's a million stories like that. Every day, you don't get into an Uber and you're like, your neck makes you look like you voted for Trump, right? Unless the guy's got a big Trump flag on the Uber, right? Like, in other words, we typically do not start conversations with people that we run into casually or more substantively with the area of the most profound disagreement. We recognize kind of naturally in a diverse civil society, you lead with the commonality. And the commonality is often like the thing you got to get done together. Like if you are giving me $4 and you're ordering a double scoop and I run an ice cream store, I'm going to give you the ice cream. That's right. And that's actually a relationship.
Yeah. That sort of looking for the complexity and nuance in the people around us, I think is just so compelling. And one way you do this in some of your own storytelling, just about your own grandmother, is striking because it seems to me as I kind of read it, and maybe in some of your early years, you weren't quite so sure about your grandmother, but then you had this experience with her when you're in India, and you discover that she had been up to kind of some risky work of serving other human beings that was very striking.
Yeah. So we had two stories about this, one about my grandmother and one about something else that's on the same theme. So again, I'm looking at my friend Kevin here behind the camera. So Kevin and I are in India together at this time. This is the summer of 1998. And I'd always thought of my grandmother as like the person wagging her finger in my face and telling me to marry in a smiley when I'm 9 years old, And when I go back to India in the summer of 1998, I realized that my grandmother is like taking all these women into her home, women who are being abused, and she's basically running like a women's shelter out of her home. Right now, it's not like a dozen women; it's like 2 or 3 women. But she's been doing this for 50 years, right? And this is her work, right? And why are you doing this? She's like, I'm a Muslim. I'm in a smiley. This is what we do. This is part of this is our social ethic, right? And she doesn't say it with any sort of pride. She just says it as if she's being like, do you want 2 chapatis or 3 chapatis for dinner, right? It's just like this natural thing. And I think I just find, that's one of the things about religion I just find so moving. Like so many of the people who just do important things in the world do it out of a religious commitment, and they just think it's a natural thing. They're not especially impressed with themselves. They just, it's just like the most natural thing. And I just find that so moving, and part of like, growing older is like developing an appreciation for your elders. You know, I mean, the classic Mark Twain line, like, you know, when I was 20, my dad was dumb. When I was 30, he'd gotten a lot smarter, you know, some version of that. But I actually want to tell a different story in the same theme. And I want to tell this in kind of a provocative way. So here's a movie that I don't think could be made now. Dead Man Walking. What's Dead Man Walking about? Dead Man Walking is about a white racist rapist. Sean Penn, that's his character. He's a rapist who's a white racist. Okay? He's committed the worst crime, rape and murder, and he has like Nazi tattoos on his body. And what's the movie about? The movie is about a sister, played by Susan Sarandon, Sister Helen Pragine, who insists on finding the humanity in this guy, insists on seeing him as something other than a rapist and a racist, and encouraging him to see himself that way. And you know what? The funny thing is, when it comes out in the late 80s, early 90s, like it is like a literary masterpiece. As a movie, you know, Eddie Vedder and Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan do the lead song. And it is like held up as like a pinnacle of a kind of virtue ethics. I don't think you could make that movie today. Because the only story we want to tell about certain kinds of people is that they're only evil. And actually, like, to get to the notion of virtue ethics, like a major part of the humanities and a major part of virtue ethics is, I am going to try to find ways to see you as something other than this.
You speak often of the ways in which, as you've already begun to allude to, you have these kind of heroes of the faith, and yet they're very diverse. They're Christian, they're Muslims, they're Jews, Hindus, and I'm especially struck by the way Dorothy Day kind of stands out in your early story. And she has moved me for many years. But talk about how how your exposure to some of the stories, these sorts of stories, began to shape your work.
Well, so the story is, this must be like the middle of the year, my sophomore year in college. So this is 1994, early 1995, and I am like a ball of rage. Like, I have like swallowed the pill on critical theory, and like way beyond what my professors, who were using it as a provocation, wanted me to do, right? I went to school in an era where it was kind of an identity politics era of the mid 1990s, and professors would do things through provocation, but they didn't mean to indoctrinate. They just meant to provoke, but I just like swallowed the pill. And I was a social justice warrior before the name comes into fashion. And it was not good. I was not healthy for other people. I was not healthy for myself. Like my roommate at the time would like stay away from the room for weeks on end because he just could not deal with another long lecture on people of color consciousness and the workers of the world uniting kind of thing, you know? And I joke about it now, but it was not healthy. And somebody out of the blue, like, I literally think of this person as an angel. I don't even know the person's name, right? Says to me, "Have you ever heard of Dorothy Day?" And I never had, but I looked her up and she seemed like pretty amazing, right? Like this woman, this Catholic woman who believes you should live as Jesus lived, and starts this thing called the Catholic Worker Movement, where people actually lived as Jesus lived, right? In solidarity with the poor and not just in service to them. Turns out there's a Catholic worker house in my hometown, Champaign-Urbana. I go to it. And you know, I was a kid who used to volunteer at all kinds of places, the Salvation Army and the men's emergency shelter and the women in transition shelter. But the Catholic worker house was a community. And you literally couldn't tell who was there because they needed shelter and who was there because they were in solidarity, right? And a bunch of the people who were Catholic workers were like former grad students at Illinois. In other words, like they were doing just fine in the kind of material and educational path, and they wanted to live in a way consistent with their idea of God. I was just so moved by that, and so that becomes my off ramp to anger. I was on the anger highway. That was my off ramp, and it was an off ramp to a different kind of way of doing social change work or civil society work, right? And so Dorothy Day becomes like my first lantern on that path, so to speak. And then I actually spent a summer in Catholic worker houses. That's how kind of taken I was by the movement. I lived at the St. Francis Catholic worker house for my first months living here in Chicago when I graduated from college in the summer in 1996. But I never wanted to become Catholic. I was very moved by the tradition, but I never wanted to become Catholic. And I kind of knew that. And so I started to like read in other religions, and quickly you find that there are other heroes, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Thich Nhat Hanh, Mahatma Gandhi. You realize that there's very much an ethic of social action and pluralism across different religions. And that's the kind of bubbling up of this idea that becomes Interfaith Youth Corps in 1998, and then more recently changes its name to Interfaith America.
Yeah.
That's the source of it.
You've indicated as well that you think that as people explore other religious traditions, they actually can become more deeply appreciative of their own.
Yeah, that was certainly my story. It took a couple of years. And again, so much of this happened with Kevin, so it's kind of fun to have him here in the room. But Kevin and I, as I said earlier, Brother Wayne Teasdale is a mentor of ours, right? And he happens to be friends with the Dalai Lama. So we're going to India that summer to see my grandmother. And it just so happens that Brother Wayne sets us up with an audience with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And I'm like,
you're how old at this time?
We're like 22, 23. And I have to say, like, these days, the Dalai Lama is not so much in the discourse. Back then, like, there were like 5 movies coming out every year about Tibet. It was like 7 Years of Tibet, and Richard Gere was going to Dharamsala. This was a time when the Dalai Lama was like a giant figure in global life. So anyway, I'm like doing my best to be a Buddhist. As like the Buddhism chapter of my spiritual journey. And I'm like trying to sit zazen. Of course, I don't know anything about this. I'm like, fold your legs and think about nothing. That's my version of it, and I couldn't fold my legs very, very well. And I could never think about nothing. And actually, when my mind finally stopped thinking about material things, it started to think about the Ismaili chant my mother taught me as a kid, Ya Ali, Ya Muhammad. And I would like try to move it out of my mind. Like, can't be a bad Buddhist. You got to focus on nothing, right? And it would keep on coming back in like a cloud, like it would just like linger there, And finally, I'm like, I can't do anything about this. I'm just going to like sit with this. And then when I go see the Dalai Lama, I'm going to lie to him and tell him that that's not it, that I've been very good at focusing on nothing, right? So Kevin and I have our audience of the Dalai Lama. For the first 5 minutes, Kevin and the Dalai Lama talk about the similarities between Buddhist and Jewish theology. And I'm kind of in awe of this. And then the Dalai Lama looks at me and says, "You're a Muslim." And I'm like, I was about to tell you about my Buddhist practice. And he looks at me again and says, "You're a Muslim." And there's something in that moment. And I think, my being with my grandmother earlier that summer, and that experience of like her taking care of these women and talking about it as a Muslim thing to do, I think that was like, those moments were very important moments for me in coming back to Islam.
Yeah.
Right. But a lot of it's also just in like when you, I think lots of people, certainly I do, have what I call an adolescent discrimination against the familiar. Anything you grew up with can't be cool. That's a great
line. Say that again.
It's actually, I'm very proud of that line.
Did you invent that line?
It's in Acts of Faith, and nobody ever quotes it, so I have to quote it myself. An adolescent discrimination against the familiar.
That's
right?
really good. Yeah.
So I'll tell you again, to like quote Kevin way more than he deserves to be quoted. So my kids kind of grow up knowing who Kevin is, his books are around the house, whatever else, right? And they like roll their eyes every time I talk about him. But once a year or so, they'll come home from school and they'll be like, "Dad, we read a poem of Kevin's in class today. Dad, we saw this documentary and Kevin was in it," right? Then they feel really cool. But like Kevin's status as dad's friend doesn't really, that does not wash, right? And I think it's like any religion you grow up with, a certain kind of personality, which I happen to have, is just going to not think it's cool.
Yeah.
And it's when other people tell you it's cool, or when you read things in other religions and think to yourself, oh, we have poets too. Oh, we have a social ethic of pluralism too. That's when you're like, oh, I actually want this.
Yeah. 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 My experience, 14 years ago or so, working on a book where I took a lot more seriously having dialogue with Muslims, and traveled to Jerusalem and spent some time with several key theologian figures there. My experience was that I, learned in much greater depth the beauty of Islam that I didn't know about, and simultaneously found a new beauty in my own faith that was enriched by that experience. And I think that's so counterintuitive to a lot of folks, because I think that there's this sort of fear that having dialogue with the other is going to diminish our own sort of set of convictions. But it seems to be so often just the opposite.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, and look, it matters about who your interlocutor is, right? Like, and very often I have had interlocutors who have been like, you come from a great religion. Just remember that, right? Like you might not feel like you're a part of it now, whatever, but this is when I was, 18 or 19 or 20. But if your interlocutor admires your tradition, that actually really matters.
Yeah.
And if you, frankly, if you know enough about your tradition to be able to use it as a reference point sometimes. So you read whatever, Blake or Tagore, and you're like, oh, we have Rumi, right? You have to know Rumi's a part of Islam to be able to make that connection.
Yeah. Another very significant piece that we've only alluded to so far at the very top of the interview is that you have a strong conviction that America is an idea worth fighting for.
I absolutely do.
Yeah. Unpack that for us a bit.
But I believe in this is a diverse democracy, right? It's the world's first attempt at diverse democracy. It is not easy to do. It is not easy. There is a reason that lots of smart people for many, many centuries believed you can't have people of different identities in a society in which they're participating in public life together. Because people of one identity will never allow people of another identity to elect a social order that they're not a part of, right? That they feel like that where they didn't win, So I think building that is absolutely worth fighting for. I also think it's very much a part of Islam, right? There's direct quotes from the Quran. God made you different nations and tribes so that you may come to know one another. You can do that in a diverse democracy. Mm-hmm. You can come to know people. In other words, you can kind of fulfill that commandment, if you will, or that command in Islam, so to speak. And there's a million other places in Islam where, the Muhammad's prophethood is first recognized by Christian monks, right? And that's an undisputed part of the Muslim story. Muhammad, when the Prophet Muhammad moves to Medina, and he creates the Constitution of Medina, which is a constitution of pluralism, right? It protects the distinctive dignity of all of the diverse communities in Medina, and it creates kind of a loyalty pact. It is written in the home of a rabbi. Okay, that is a big deal, right? It is just part when a group of Christians come to Medina to argue theology with the prophet, the nature of Jesus, and it comes time for them to give their prayers, the prophet invites them to pray in his mosque. These are again, I will say, these are undisputed parts of the Muslim story. Part of what I am doing is saying they're central, right? This is how we should understand the tradition.
Yeah. You've also talked about the way James Baldwin has kind of helped you have a larger vision, perhaps, for America, which I think might be counterintuitive to a lot of folks. So talk about that a bit.
I mean, so the funny, it is interesting to me that it would be counterintuitive, because I actually think that what I have is a straightforward reading of Baldwin, at least in the Fire Next Time days, right? And so Fire Next Time takes place actually here in Chicago, and it's a 3-part story. Part 1 is Baldwin's increased, not just awakening to, but kind of experience of the brutality of American racism in the early 60s, right? And his connection of how his church, which is a black church, was kind of complicit in that. And part of this is Baldwin's being gay, and how the black church must have made him, at that time, must have made him think about being gay, right? So that's part 1. And part 2 is Baldwin is accepting an invitation to the home of Elijah Muhammad here in Chicago. Again, I think this is summer of 1963. And what he wants is Elijah Muhammad's anger. He understands the anger. And he comes to his home because he understands the anger. And what he experiences at that home is not the world he wants to live in, right? So he experiences this like very stark gender segregation. He experiences like every time Elijah Muhammad would say something, no matter how unhinged, everybody would nod and basically say yes. He experiences kind of like this ugliness of like the white devil this, the white devil that. You know, Elijah Muhammad said, you know, we're going to drive you home, so you have no you have no risk of like meeting a white devil and getting poisoned by his alcohol. And Baldwin's thinking, I'm on my way to see a white friend and have a drink, right? And so the realization is like, I don't want to live in this world. And I actually think that's such a useful point of reflection for any activist. It's not just about being angry against something. It's the question of what world you want to live in. Right. So you can understand Elijah Muhammad's anger.
Sure.
Do you want to live in that world? Right. Like be careful how you get rid of the Shah, because you might be installing the Ayatollah. Right. And so Baldwin then does something enormously courageous. In part 3, he's basically like, okay, so what do we want? Well, our best chance is to advance America. It's not America where it's at. It's America what it could be. But we have to affirm America what it could be. Right. If we want to build a world where more of us have dignity, then you have to give it its best chance, which means you have to take a hope-filled understanding of America. And so he's got these just stunningly poetic lines, right? I am not a ward of this state. I am one of the first Americans to arrive on these shores. I mean, that line like changed my life. I might have read it first in India in the summer of 1998, right? I am not a ward of this state. I'm one of the first Americans to arrive at these shores, right? Like basically, I am going to assume an ownership stake. I have been here longer than the rest of you. I'm going to assume an ownership stake, right?
Right.
I arrived in chains, but the part of that story I'm going to emphasize is I arrived.
Right. Yeah. You quote the poet Edwin Markham, early 20th century poet, voice especially for those who labor. The poem is, he drew a circle that shut me out, heretic, rebel, a thing to flout, but love and I had the wit to win.
We drew a circle that drew him in.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that. I love that poem. Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's simple. It says so much, which is basically like, if you are going to have an ethic which marginalizes me, I have a couple chances of how, I have a couple of choices of how to respond. Number 1, I can just accept the marginalization. Number 2, I can respond in kind and say, no, I'm going to marginalize you. You know, you're going to call me an ugly racial epithet. I'm going to call you a white supremacist, right? Edward Markham's like, why don't you just like do the Jedi move of like saying, actually, the opposite of you calling me a racial epithet is not me calling you a racial epithet. It's saying, let's live in a world without racial epithets.
So what resources fuel, sustain that sort of posture for you?
Yeah, so the Prophet at Hudaybiyah, the Prophet Muhammad at Hudaybiyah, it's a famous Muslim story. Does that where like his it's a long story, so I won't get into it. Read the book. We Need to Build. I tell it there. There's another famous story about the Prophet that's shorter where a woman is throwing filth at the Prophet day after day, and one day she doesn't appear on the balcony, and the Prophet inquires after her health, like is concerned about her, and stories like that exist in every religion, right?
Yeah.
But here's another story that I learned about in South Africa, where crazily enough I go with Kevin also. When Mandela is in prison in Robben Island, he's there for 26 years. That is a long time. Okay, that is a long time. He learns the language of his jailers. Mandela's Xhosa, right, from the Xhosa tribe, which has a language. His jailers are white Afrikaners. There's a language called Afrikaans. He learns the language as a sign of respect for his jailers. He learns the names of his jailers' kids. Mandela cannot see his own kids, and he's asking questions about his jailers' kids. So, who's in prison?
Yeah.
Right? Like Mandela is basically saying, I mean, just overtly saying, you will not make my dignity small. I will not allow you to do that. And my dignity calls on me to be in this kind of a relationship with you.
I mean, one way you kind of summarize what you're describing there, you say, quote, "This, it seems to me, is what effective activism looks like, a positive engagement of the people with whom you disagree."
Yeah. And I think that, one of the things I read about at the end of We Need to Build is that, so first of all, I think that is the moral thing to do, right? Now, I think that there are limits. I don't think you can do that with Nazis, but Gandhi does this with the British, right? Like basically, can you speak to what a person could be? I mean, one of the ways I'm starting to say this now, and this is a dangerous thing to tweet, which is why I haven't tweeted it. But I think it's a less dangerous thing to say on a podcast, which is we have to learn how to disagree with people's politics without denigrating their identity, right? And in fact, I think the way to convince somebody is to basically say, I had a higher view of you than the manner in which you are acting. I view you and your identity with more magnificence than the manner in which you are acting, right? And I don't know why we have devolved into a politics where you disagree with somebody's politics and then you insult their identity. What do you expect them to do if you insult their identity?
Yeah, right.
Do you expect that to right? And it's this idea that I am going to confront everything and I'm going to eliminate it. Well, you are probably not going to eliminate it, right? And part of the genius of a king and a Mandela is the recognition of the day after I win, the day after that, I'm going to have to live with you. So I'm not going to tell myself a story in which you are subhuman.
Yeah.
Because the day after, I'm going to have to unstitch that story.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it is in my interest. First of all, it's part of my dignity to tell a story where you are human. And you might not be living up to that ideal, but I'm not going to be the one who denigrates you, right? And it is also, so that is the moral thing to do. That's the virtue ethics thing to do, okay?
Yeah.
But it's also in my enlightened self-interest to not create a framework in which a future citizen of a democracy in South Africa or the United States, I have created an image of being as subhuman.
Yeah. Before we close, I think there's one big question that I can imagine some people perhaps wanting to ask, and that is how you think about religious pluralism, because you're making an extended case for pluralism, and it's common trope around some forms of pluralism that it's a sort of, especially in religious pluralism, that it's a sort of posture that says, well, all the religions are just saying the same thing.
Yeah.
But you're insisting that's not the kind of pluralism that you're looking for.
So, this is actually simple, which is we people from different religions are going to disagree on salvation, and they can work together on earth. And isn't that obvious, right? And actually, don't our religions call us to do that, right? So in every religion, there is a theology of service. So if the Catholics have a theology of service, which inspires them to start a disaster relief agency, and the Mormons have a theology of service, which inspires them to start a disaster relief agency, and the Southern Baptists have it, shouldn't those disaster relief agencies work together? I mean, what are you going to do? Show up at the earthquake and be like, I'm not working with the people going to hell?
Yeah.
Serious. But I'm actually being totally serious.
Yeah.
Right? I'm being totally, like, you show up at the earthquake and you're like, my faith calls us to do this. And the people over there are like, my faith calls us to do this too. All right, well, we'll might as well do it together.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
We can go to separate churches at the end.
Yeah.
Right? So that's simple. I don't think anybody disagrees with that.
Yeah.
The second part of it is a little bit more complicated, but also I think something that people don't disagree with, which is all of our religions also have a theology of interfaith cooperation. The Good Samaritan story is the central part of the theology of interfaith cooperation for Christians. Who's the Samaritan? Samaritan is not just some random other.
You're right.
The Samaritan is the religious other.
And a religious hated other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What does, and actually Samaritans are people that Jesus disagrees with elsewhere in the Gospels, right? The conversation with the woman by the well. You pray to the wrong God. You pray at the wrong temple. It's a doctrinal disagreement. Fine, right? So what's the Good Samaritan story? Okay, well, who are the characters who did the wrong thing? The people who are part of your own religion. They might have been ritualistically right? In fact, part of the story is they were ritualistically right. They were legally right. Who's the person who's ethically right? It's the person who's ritualistically wrong, right? It's the Samaritan. And Jesus at the end says, go and do likewise. And the beginning of the story is, who is my neighbor, right? And so that is the perfect example of a theology of interfaith cooperation.
Yeah, that's very helpful.
By the way, we don't have to agree on doctrine, and we don't have to think doctrine is unimportant. We just have to agree that doctrine is not the only important thing.
Yeah. Or I guess I would say that your description of the Good Samaritan is itself a doctrine, and it's an immensely helpful doctrine. Yeah.
Well, I would call it a so if we're like doing the dancing in the head of a pin type thing here, right? I think doctrine, my understanding of doctrine is things like, this is our story of creation. This is our story of salvation, right? These are our laws, right? Theology, I understand more of as like an interpretive way in which we weave together various stories from the tradition. So I would call this a theology of interfaith cooperation. Like Muslim doctrine is Muhammad is the last prophet. That's not changing, and I certainly am not changing that, right? That is not something for me to dispute. There's people who are more knowledgeable about Islam who could dispute that. They're not going to, but that, you see what I'm saying? Yeah. I just take that as a given, right? A theology is something that I have standing in because if you know the breadth, if you know enough about the doctrine of the faith and enough of the stories of the faith, which stories you weave together, that's a theology.
Yeah. Various people are going to do different things, but the effective functionality of what you're describing translates across the different traditions, I think.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
On that note, do I remember correctly that the first full-time employee that you all hired was evangelical Christian?
April Kunzi Mendez.
Yeah. And that you all kind of came to this sort of agreement that we might even, I think you said, we might even be praying that the other one will convert, but that's not where we're going to focus our outward attention. We're going to focus upon the kind of service we think we're called to do.
Yes. One can tell that as a dramatic story, but the truth is literally every workplace in America has that right now.
Right.
Every workplace in America has people who think somebody else is going to hell, and they're actually doing really excellent work together. They're coaches on teams. They're heart surgeons at hospitals. And I just think we should tell that is an inspiring story.
Yeah.
That's the only way to have a religiously diverse democracy.
Yeah. In all that the ground we've gotten to cover, anything you wish I had asked you that I haven't asked you?
No, I don't think so. Thank
Yeah.
you for this.
Yeah. You, at the end of your most recent book, in your letter to your sons, you cite your favorite line from the Quran. Would you end with that?
Is it this? That God sent you to be nothing but a special mercy upon all the worlds? Rahmatul Alameen. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
God sent in the Quran. God actually says it to the prophet, right? So I'm extrapolating, but this notion like God sent you to be nothing, not just a mercy, a special mercy, and not just to one world, but to all the worlds.
Yeah.
You know, I just think that's so beautiful.
Yeah, it is beautiful. Thank you for your time, and
Thanks,
thank you
Lee.
for your good work in the world.
I appreciate you. Thank you for spending the time with us.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Hello, my friends. Are you looking to find those true stories no one has ever told you about? Then you should check out the chart-topping podcast, Here's Where It Gets Interesting, hosted by longtime teacher Sharon McMahon, who you may know from her viral Instagram account, Sharon Says So. Here's Where It Gets Interesting will ignite your curiosity about the fascinating stuff that was not in history textbooks, like the sweeping history of Native Americans in the U.S., or the unknown stories that led to former Vice President Hubert Humphrey's pivotal impact in the civil rights movement. Not to mention, Sharon's joined by notable thought leaders, including former U.S. Representative Adam Kinzinger and no small endeavor friend and pastor Esau McCauley, who share insights about history, culture, and politics. So get the facts and listen to Here's Where It Gets Interesting with Sharon McMahon, wherever you get your podcasts. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Harriet Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Ellis Osborne, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
From PRX.